people who have chosen to be involved in the community. You don't have to put up your hand and play a role, but you do. You do it because you care about the future of the city. And that's why I put up my hand to serve my community as well. At City Hall, there's great collaboration happening as well. I promised when I ran for mayor that I would get people working together again. J'ai promis, lorsque je me suis présenté à la mairie, que je ferai en sorte que les gens travaillent ensemble. And I've heard from a lot of residents that they've noticed a change in tone at City Hall over the last couple of years. They're glad to see their elected officials collaborating rather than fighting with each other. And even when we don't agree, the tone is, most of the time, very respectful. In December, the budget passed by a vote of 22-3 with resounding support from councillors throughout the city. We've also been working closely with our federal and provincial partners. And yes, I've been fighting very hard and very vocally on the issue of fairness. I've been clear about the fact that Ottawa needs our fair share of funding from those other two levels of government. And I will never, ever stop doing that. J'ai été vocal sur le fait qu'Ottawa a besoin de sa juste part de financement. Et je ne cesserai jamais de le faire. But we are working together. We've secured more than $1 billion in funding for Ottawa over the past 2 years. And I am hopeful that we will have more good news to share in the coming weeks. When I look around this room, I see a lot of leaders. I see people who have chosen to live and invest in and support their community, to support Ottawa. It's the same thing I experience when I'm at the Rural Summit or I'm skating on the Rideau Canal, as I did on the weekend, when I'm visiting a community center or a library, or I'm speaking to a group of volunteers. And I'll tell you, that inspires me. It inspires me to keep going. It inspires me to do everything I can. It gives me the energy I need to continue my work as your mayor. I'm so grateful to the people of Ottawa, and I continue to be very excited about our potential as a city, notwithstanding the challenges that we face. Next year, Ottawa will celebrate its bicentennial. It will be 200 years since Bytown was founded in 1826. I don't think the founders of Bytown could have imagined what we have today. We have so much to celebrate. We should be very grateful to the people who built this city over the last 2 centuries. But I think we have a responsibility. We have a duty to build an even better city for the future. Nous avons une responsabilité. Nous avons le devoir de construire une ville encore meilleure. We have a duty to our children and grandchildren. We have a duty to the people who are arriving in this city and will be the leaders of the future. We have a responsibility to make Ottawa everything it can be. So yes, we face some big challenges, but we can still be optimists. We can be proud of our city. We can be inspired by its potential. We can face these challenges and come out stronger. We can be hopeful because we know in Ottawa we work together. So let's never forget how far we've come. Let's never forget how lucky we are. Let's never forget how much opportunity we have. N'oublions jamais combien d'opportunités nous avons. Let's never underestimate the value of bringing people together even while others are trying to drive people apart. Let's continue to strike the right balance between supporting economic growth and showing compassion for our most vulnerable residents, because that's the way we do things in Ottawa. Thank you. Merci beaucoup.
Great way to start this economic forecast. Thank you once again to His Worship Mayor Mark Sutcliffe. There's lots more to deal with on our agenda. We've got our chief economist and a panel devoted to the new Trump presidency. It's now my pleasure to introduce Neil Schwartz, who is a senior banker from Mann Lawyers. Mann has been a long-standing supporter of this event, and very pleased to have their support. And it really does, as Suling always mentions, take a lot of great sponsors to make events like this possible. So my personal thanks to Man Lawyers. Here is Neil Schwartz.
Thank you, Michael. Lovely to be back here. This is one of our favorite events of the year, and Man Lawyer has been a proud supporter and sponsor of the luncheon for many years. It's nice to see so many people out. As the mayor alluded to earlier, we have such a strong business community in Ottawa. Lots of interesting and challenging days ahead, but it's nice to know that we're all in it together. It's my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker today. And before I do that, I'll just remind you all, for those that were in the room last year, we had the pleasure of welcoming Dr. Trevin Stratton to present the outlook for the year. And at the very last moment, the monitor that he was using for his notes malfunctioned, and he gave the presentation without any notes, just off the cuff. So he set the bar high, but there's no pressure. I'm sure Don is up to the challenge. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dawn Desjardins, who's an economist and executive with experience in researching economic and policy issues. Over her career, she has communicated complex issues to clients, decision makers, and media audiences. She was RBC's deputy chief economist, a reporter for Bloomberg Financial News in Canada, and a bond strategist at JP Morgan Canada. At RBC, Dawn managed a team of economists who were responsible for the economic and financial market forecasts for Canada and the US. A passionate advocate of women's labor market engagement, in recent years, Dawn used her research to start conversations, drive policy discussions, and affect change. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dawn Desjardins to the stage.
Thank you, thank you. Good afternoon. It's a great pleasure to be here. I hope you feel that way when I've completed my comments, but I was thinking it's been a heck of a 2025 in the past 3 weeks. It is all very difficult, to put it very plainly. But I'd like to present our forecast for the economy in 2025, and then talk to you about, well, the not as great outcome that is certainly possible. I guess the one thing we all know is that we are operating in a period of great uncertainty. It's not just what's happening south of the border with the new administration providing not exactly clear guidance on how they're going to proceed. But we are also living in a time when we have lots of geopolitical events that are taking a lot of resources, that are causing a lot of uncertainty for decision makers across the globe. And as a result, we have seen financial markets become increasingly volatile. And we've seen businesses, as an example, the Conference Board, they had a survey of 1,700 global CEOs and CFOs. And what those leaders of businesses said was, in fact, that 85% of them were considering changing their supply chains over the next 3 to 5 years. So all to highlight that all of this uncertainty, this fragmentation, is certainly weighing on how business is being conducted and what big decisions these business leaders are trying to make as we go through this relatively difficult time. Now, when we look at the global economy, still looking for growth is the good news in 2025, 3 to 3.25% globally. The U.S. economy expected to do really well in the year ahead, simply because they are going to have a lot of policies that are going to be supportive of growth, whether it's changes to tax rates, even with the prospect of even lowering corporate tax rates. So stimulus continuing in the U.S., and we think that will drive their economy growing quite conceivably between 2.5% and 3.75%. And that's quite a feat given that they have been expanding so rapidly over the past few years. Now, other parts of the global economy, however, not so strong, but gaining momentum. And the real reason for that is more cyclical factors. The fact that we have seen inflation rates come down globally, and many central banks who are now able to pivot their policy away from trying to reduce the speed of their economies and dampen inflation pressures, now to supporting the pace of economic growth. And for Canada, it really is going to be those cyclical factors that we baked into our baseline. But as you can see in red, I have that risks are elevated. Now, our view is that we will see the economy grow by 2% in 2025. Now, that's the baseline view. It's one we have more confidence in than the alternative. But having said that, it is one that we will be very much looking to change as conditions change. And those cyclical factors, though, that are helping Canada are inflation has come down quite significantly. When we look at what the inflation rate averaged in 2024, that was about 2.4%. We just got that data today. Now, when we look at 2023, the average inflation rate was closer to 4%. So definitely the case that we've seen improvement, and the most recent data point showing a sub 2% inflation rate. So definitely the case that inflation pressures, which had been so draining on Canadian consumers as well as businesses, really coming back to more regular or normal levels. And against that backdrop, the Bank of Canada has taken the opportunity to remove some of the monetary policy tightening they were really required to put into place to get the economy moving in a direction where we weren't seeing quite such robust demand that was putting upward pressure on prices. We all know that it wasn't just domestically driven factors that drove up those inflation rates, but as the combination of some of those global factors eased and we saw slowing in economic momentum, we did see the economy come back into a slower pace of growth, but inflation, probably more importantly, come down significantly. So the bank has already lowered the policy rate by 175 basis points, the last two moves being pretty big moves of 50 basis points. So definitely the case that this is allowing our economy to get some support from lower interest rates and lower price gains. And we do think we will continue to see the policy rate move down. Now, questionable whether we'll continue to see it at quite the same rate we have. And in fact, we think they're probably going to follow a more cautious road towards reducing policy restraint, getting the policy rate to 2.25%. So still good news ahead in terms of what's going on for businesses and for the consumer. Now, one of the big problems we were looking at when we were thinking about the forecast in 2024 was we had high interest rates, we had elevated debt levels. What was going to happen to the consumer? How are they going to manage through this? And in fact, what we have seen is as these interest rates have come down, we've started to see some relief in terms of debt service costs. Now, obviously, there's still going to be punitive for some households. And we know that there's lots of refinancing that are going to take place in terms of mortgages in both 2025 and in 2026. But this chart is showing that turn, and that's before the final 100 basis points of rate reductions were actually in place. So we do feel somewhat better in terms of how the consumer is going to be able to manage through this period of refinancing. And even when we look at data like mortgages in arrears, they have risen, but they remain historically really under control. The other thing that Canadian households have done is they've really beefed up their savings. Definitely the case that the pandemic-related savings that were put in place in Canada, our savings, remain pretty much intact. Not so in the US, where the US economy has grown more rapidly, but they've also really depleted all of those rainy day savings. In Canada, we have high savings rates, and we think this is really going to help those households that are really going to have to navigate through this higher cost environment as they go to refinance their mortgage. So what does it mean? It means that in our view, in our base case view, the Canadian consumer is going to spend in 2025. Not crazy amounts of money, but nonetheless, it is going to be the case that rather than seeing relatively limited consumption activity, and when we think back to what drove consumption in 2024, it really was population growth. And we know that that factor is changing. We are going to see perhaps even declines in our population as we go through the next few years. But we do think that because of all of those other conditions, lower inflation, lower interest rates, we will in fact see spending accelerate, and even on a per capita basis, we will see that also increase. Now, one area which everyone loves to talk about and think about, because we are all heavily invested in some way or another, is the housing market. And in the housing market, too, we're seeing those benefits from these lower interest rates. We've started to see a pickup in home sales activity. Now, we think we will continue to see that occur as we go through the course of 2025. But it's probably not going to be a snapback in terms of housing market activity. And there's a couple factors behind that view. One is that, we have seen a price correction in housing prices in Canada. But look at where it is compared to where we were pre-pandemic. We're still in a world where housing affordability is extraordinarily stretched. And one of the reasons for that, well, there's a few. One is that we've had such strong demand for housing, and that means that prices have not decelerated rapidly. Even though home sales activity may be softer, we're not seeing prices fall sharply. Affordability is still tough, and of course, that's because we have a supply problem in Canada in terms of our housing. So we think that slowly we will see housing activity pick up. But again, we think about all of those factors that have contributed to the pullback in construction activity. Now, some of them have improved. As I say, we have lower input costs as well. We have lower interest rates. But now when we look forward, we're still going to be confronted with some real challenges in terms of labor. We have lots of shortages in terms of people who work in the construction industry. So while we are, I would say, optimistic that we'll see a pickup in supply going forward, we certainly know governments are providing some support to do that. It is also going to remain a challenge, just given the scarcity of skilled labor in this country. Now, one of those factors, of course, is coming through in terms of how we're going to proceed with the immigration file. Now, the government has announced that they are going to reduce the number of permanent residents, the number of foreign students, as well as non-permanent residents. And it is conceivable, if they are able to do what they've suggested, we'll actually see a decline in our population growth in 2026 and 2027, because we don't think it can switch on a dime. So we'll probably see some modest growth in 2025. Now, one of the reasons that we're seeing policy changes is, of course, as I said, lots of pressure on demand for housing, as well, of course, for social services. So we have seen a significant increase in the supply of labor, and that is going to ease off as we go forward. And when we look at the demand side, that too, we have seen some softening, but it's really interesting when we think about Canada's labor market. Vacancies, which had spiked, lots of people looking for people to hire in the post-pandemic period, those vacancies have returned to more normal levels. But what I find kind of intriguing is that we continue to see some really robust hiring activity. We're not seeing companies in Canada lay off, but of course, when we're thinking about a labor force that's growing aggressively because your population growth is growing, you can have strong employment growth, but your unemployment rate still rises because you're a little bit out of balance. And as we go forward and we see some softening on the labor force side, we think that we will, in fact, see our unemployment rate reverse and start to move lower. Now, business surveys, and one that was released by the Bank of Canada just yesterday, suggests that on balance, companies are saying, yeah, we're not really going to be ramping up considerably in terms of our employment, but by the same token, I think probably more importantly, you're not seeing huge amounts of people, or companies rather, saying they're going to lay off people. And that really is such an important factor for the economy, for the consumer sector, and for the housing sector as we go forward. What was interesting, I thought, was the survey said that there was a pretty big jump in terms of companies that said they were going to invest in the next 12 months, which is something, as we are constantly reading and know, is really important for Canada, for our prosperity, for our productivity as we move forward. But if you dug a little deeper, these companies are saying, well, we're going to increase investment a little bit. And in particular, in the sectoral breakdown, it was oil and gas. Those are the companies that are putting money to work. So we're still in a situation where we're not necessarily seeing broad-based increases in investment activity. Now, we have done our own survey of CFOs, and what CFOs in Canada said is that, and now I want to disclose that this is even before the Trump administration or President-elect Trump threatened tariffs on Canada. 70% of the CFOs we surveyed said, yeah, now's not a good time to take on risks. So I can't even imagine what that number is going to be like when we do our next survey. And what's interesting is it had come down a bit. It was 93% in the third quarter. But the next bar is looking at the overall North American survey. And there was a complete flip. In the previous quarter, overall North American CFOs were saying, no, not a good time yet. I think the number for them was something like 88%. But you can see now that that has turned on its head. And in fact, companies outside of Canada really looking forward to taking on more risk, believing that the environment is more a good opportunity for them to take on more risks. So for Canada, you know, this is going to be a very difficult time to see companies really taking on risk, which is only natural in an environment of very strong and very elevated levels of uncertainty. And I put this in, and I'm not sure why, because it's just such a downer. You know, when we look at investment between Canada and the US, this is not something that just suddenly happened. You know, we have not been investing in our economy, in our workers for a sustained period of time. So all this talk of productivity, it's really amazing that it's top of mind, you're in conversations, but from an economics point of view, it has been a significant amount of time that we have lagged our US counterparts. The C.D. Howe Institute put together a study looking at dollars put behind workers. So they said if a US company puts a dollar behind a US worker in terms of investment in whatever it is, technology, machinery, a Canadian company puts 52 cents. So it certainly goes some distance to explain why we are not as productive as our counterparts south of the border. Now, when we look at prospects for business investment, this is one area where we continue to be, I would say, not optimistic. We do think that there's a lot of good conditions in place that should help entice businesses to invest, but we have this long shadow over us in terms of what is the policy stance of the US administration. What's that going to look like for Canada? And is it going to be reconciled anytime soon? I mean, the answer is probably no, but nonetheless, the fact that we're having all of this uncertainty really is only a sensible reaction to say, well, I'm going to keep my powder dry at this stage. I'm going to invest, but I have to see what the landscape looks like. Now, when we look at where we are seeing growth emanate, again, in our baseline, it is on the export front. The fact that we can supply more energy to export markets, we think that is going to be a real win for our export situation. The Canadian dollar, the only upside to it being so weak is that it makes our goods cheaper when we're trying to export them to other markets. So we do think that we will see strengthening in our export story. So that was all the good news. Now, when we look at what might happen, I mean, I feel like I'm being pretty upbeat here, but that may not be the case when we go through the course of this year, and I don't want you to say I didn't warn you. Yes, here's our forecast for 2025, 2% growth, and for all of those sort of cyclical reasons I've cited, as well as the fact that we are still seeing support flow into the economy from the government sector. But if we see the U.S. government levy 25% tariffs on our exports into the U.S. Now, this has a lot of assumptions built into it. We're not the only ones. We think that if you saw that in conjunction with China being subjected to higher tariffs, that other countries also, not 25%, but perhaps 10%, what would that look like? Well, in our estimation, that would take about a full percentage point off Canada's growth rate in 2025. Now, if we retaliated, that means that rather than having growth of 2% in 2025, we would probably see a contraction in our economy of about 1%. So, I mean, all to say, there are some factors that are positive for the outlook. There are some factors that, on balance, you could say are bad in so much as we're not going to see the population growth, and we are going to continue to be really working under an environment of extraordinarily high uncertainty. And then we have the ugly. So the good, the bad, and the ugly is sort of where I'm going to end my comments. It is certainly the case that it is a very difficult environment for Canadians, for Canadian companies. When we look at Ontario in particular, thinking about our exposure to exports to the U.S., I mean, obviously, motor vehicles and parts, but we also have critical minerals and steel and aluminum. So we have a lot of real risk there. Our forecast for Ontario is pretty much in line with what we have nationally, about 1.9%. So it's just slightly lower because we do have higher proportion of our population that has high debt, household debt balances. But again, the risks continue to be very high for our provinces as well, because just about 20% of our GDP is related to exports to the United States. So it will be a challenge as we go forward. As the mayor said, Ottawa has a lot of good things happening, a lot of challenges too, but I think that is just sort of over the arching story for all companies in Canada, all cities, as well as, of course, the provincial economy. So thank you for that. Su Ling, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you so much, Dawn, for that, mostly. No, the truth is our friend. Thank you, Mayor Sutcliffe. Bye. I'd like to welcome to the stage now Catherine Fortin-Lefebvre, who is the VP of International Policy and Global Partnerships at the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, as well as Alison Gifford, who is the VP of Policy and Public Affairs at Clear Strategy, just to talk a little bit more about he who shall not be named. Okay. Yeah, and then we're going to open up for questions. So I think we have some microphones on the floor, but we're going to have some opening remarks here first. I might just stand here if that's okay. Sure. Just because of the sight lines here. So we had a beautiful introduction of Dawn. Thank you, Neil. But maybe, even though we shared your bios, maybe Alison and Catherine, I might ask you to say a sentence or two about your background so we can just get a sense of the context from which we're having the conversation. So
happy to. Catherine, can I ask you to pull me back that way?
Oh,
thank you.
We're both short,
So, thank you. Hi, thanks everyone for having me today. My name is Alison Gifford. I've been here in Ottawa since 2008. I was born here in '77 and came back and never left. When one of those great cities for people from small towns, and I've been very, very happy here. I came here and originally worked in politics on the Hill. I was a speechwriter and a press secretary during Jack Layton's NDP, and then just quickly after that, suddenly there was this big need to hire NDP lobbyists, so I ended up going into the government relations world. Had a few different jobs on different files, but I think the ones that are most relevant for you all today dealing with supply chains and tariffs is I was with UPS for 5 years as their director of government relations, and I was with Amazon for 3 years as a senior manager of public policy. So during that time, worked with both very supply chain intensive companies navigating the first round of Trump tariffs and the renegotiation of the CUSMA. And I'm happy to share a couple things I learned along the way.
Catherine?
So my name is Catherine Fortin-Lefebvre, and I am the VP of International Policy and Global Partnerships at the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. I've been in the public relations, government relations world for the past 20 years or so. Had the pleasure of working with Allison while I was at AWS in a policy role before being at the Chamber. I also had the pleasure of running for City Council a long time ago. It's been 10 years. So, at my current position, I oversee our international work at the Chamber, and that also means overseeing our international engagements, which of course is very much focused on US-Canada. It also entails managing, hosting the B7 this year, so I'll put out a little plug on that. The B7 is the Business 7. It's the official business engagement group that relates to the G7, and as most of you may know, Canada has the G7 presidency this year. That will be in Kananaskis in June, but we will be holding the B7 summit in May, the 14th to the 16th in Ottawa. So a great opportunity to get involved in global business policy discussions as we welcome all of our G7 country counterparts to our nation's capital this spring.
Thanks for mentioning that, Catherine. Actually, that's a really important opportunity for us as the City of Ottawa, of course, to host, but also to galvanize our local business community as we have been talking about some of the challenges and that being a strategy for moving forward. And also to thank you for the support that you've been giving us at the Canadian Chamber to our local chambers across the country. I know our colleagues were at the inauguration yesterday, so thank you for that. I'm just going to ask each of you maybe to make a few opening observations about the current situation and prospects that we have as it relates to the new U.S. administration. So, Donna, since you just finished up, maybe I'll lean on these guys first. So, Allison, do you want to start us off?
Sure, absolutely.
Great, thank you.
So from a political perspective, I think what's different this time than the last time is just the level of preparation we've had going into this. When I think of the first time around, we had a bit of a Camelot moment with new Prime Minister Trudeau. There was a lot of unity. There was a lot of coming together as a team and dealing with Donald Trump. I didn't see that this time. I saw a lot of politicians going individually on U.S. networks, having a lot of our grievances aired, our national unity grievances aired in front of the U.S. government. And I think, a U.S. diplomat said to me yesterday, can you imagine if a governor in the U.S. was going out and speaking on behalf of the president? And I was like, no, I guess when you put it in that context, Prime Minister Ford does look a little strange to the Americans. So that, I really don't think that put us on the best footing going into this. I think we showed a lot of vulnerability that we're going to have to make up for now. And I'm genuinely hopeful that that happens. I think every day we're taking it a bit more seriously and getting our game faces on. So I'll pass it over to you.
I mean, let's be honest, this is game-changing, a 25% tariff. It has not been put in place officially yet, but we have every reason to believe that it likely will be with an asterisk. So it's creating a lot of uncertainty. At the Canadian Chamber, we're getting tons of questions on impacts, and truthfully, we don't know how it'll manifest itself. Nobody knows. And if there's one thing we've learned from engaging with our U.S. counterparts is that anybody who tells you what Trump is going to do are fools. Nobody knows except himself, and there's plenty of examples of that. I mean, just yesterday we were fielding a lot of media calls asking for a reaction to the fact that Canadian tariffs on Canada weren't mentioned during his inauguration speech, which we were very pleased to see. But I think I did my last interview at 4:30 yesterday, and the reporter asked me, well, you know, isn't this positive? Are you happy that there's no tariffs? And I said, the day is not over yet. And, you know, sure enough, that evening, off the cuff, signing executive orders, President Trump mentions that he will likely, obviously it's not for sure, be instituting those 25% tariffs across the board on Canada on February 1st. And so, you know, if there's one message here that we're learning is things are changing quickly, and nobody knows what's going to happen. We know our government doesn't know. We don't know, but we're preparing as best we can. And I would say part of that preparation entails telling the story of the importance of the relationship. I think most Canadians, it's a fundamental understanding, especially amongst business people, why it's so important to be working with our US counterparts, a lot less so for our American friends. So just at the Chamber with our networks, we've been spending a lot of time over the last year, especially in the last couple of months, telling that story of the integration of our economies and how it will deeply hurt American businesses and consumers if these tariffs are put in place. And that's a story that's just not well known, right? So for example, our business data lab at the Canadian Chamber came out with a report earlier in the fall modeling the impacts of a 10% tariff. Seems like a long time ago, but remember when we were talking about a 10% tariff and we were like, oh my gosh, that's crazy. And then November 25th came and the number rose to 25. And so our economists modeled that 25% at costing Canadians $1,900 a year per person, Canadian, if we got to this point of 25%. But for the Americans, and maybe this is the more important point, the impact on them is also large. It's not as big, but it's still noteworthy. It's about $1,000 a year per person, USD. So the contrast there is just so stark in that we know that you know, Trump has spent so much time talking about the lack of affordability. And you know, when we hear Trump supporters talking about why they voted for Trump, a lot of them will mention that it's, you know, getting prices back to where they were, being able to afford groceries again. And wow, this will not do that. It will be inflationary. And so, you know, that is part of our arsenal, is like we are much better working together. If we want to grow the economy, we should be collaborating, not fighting each other. So that's what we're working on.
Thank you, Catherine. And knowledge is power, and so thank you for the work at the Business Data Labs and that Canada-US tracker that you've created. We'll share that as well with the group so that they can monitor it. Dawn, turn it over to you.
I think it's very much, as Catherine said, you know, we think about what we send to the United States, and the big one that perhaps, well, I don't think he's necessarily thinking about it this way, but I mean, the reason we have a trade surplus from our perspective is because we send energy, oil, to the United States, and we account for 58% of the oil they import. Now, that is not an insignificant amount. So it's more to say, how do we convince people? Because when we look at all the rest of it, we actually have a trade deficit with the United States. So it is one rather huge portion of our trade balance with the United States. As well, as we all know, I'm never sure the exact numbers, but sometimes I see it 7, sometimes I see it 8, but that when you're trying to build, when companies are trying to build an automobile, it's 7 or 8 times across the 3 country borders. So how expensive could that be? How would that be implemented? Obviously, big problems for a lot of the border states. I mean, some of these states, and I believe it's something like 20, have Canada as their top export market. So how is that going to impact them if we retaliate with tariffs? So it is very, very complicated, and I'm not exactly sure how people can convince President Trump that this is really damaging, but I think that is, as my colleagues have said, you know, it's talking to the people who can convince him, and I'm not really sure who those are.
Yeah, you know who they are. Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg. No, I appreciate you saying that, Don, and that's been a strategy, Catherine, that we've employed at the Canadian and the Ontario Chambers to really be on the ground these last few months talking to influencers. If each of you could offer one piece of advice to our businesses or our governments and or our organizations like the Board of Trade representing the interest of business, what would it be? Alison?
Know your supply chains. Prepare for supply chain disruptions, look at your inventory, look where it comes from, where you could, adjust your supply chains to look at other providers outside of the US or domestically. And your leverage, to get back to the government, I think one simple piece of information is that on the Canadian side, at least with retaliatory tariffs, there will be a 15 to 30-day period where you can provide feedback to the federal government. So if your industry is really affected by this, or if it's not clear, if you don't understand, if felt pens are subject to tariffs but not ballpoint pens, all that stuff, the department driving this is finance. You or your associations want to give that communication back to the government so that they can make these tariffs as painless for you as possible. So, big companies hire people like me to do that, but small companies, SMBs, restaurant associations, chambers of commerce, boards of trade, they can advocate on a collective industry and on a collective voice. So I wouldn't, know your supply chain, know how you're going to be hit, and then also just know that you do have some recourse.
Thank you. Dawn, what would that one piece of advice be from you?
Well, I think one of the things is that we do know that it's not going to be just the exporting companies, so exporting industries that are going to be hurt by this. I mean, we'll start to see over time job losses within those industries, but it will permeate throughout the entire economy. So it's more to say, if you're in a very export-oriented company, that's one thing, and you're going to be looking at all of these different factors. But it's also for companies that aren't going to be directly hit by the slowdown that the economy is going to, as I've shown you, if it did come to pass and we saw a contraction of 0.8% in GDP in 1 year, that would be astounding. But it's not going to be just those goods-producing companies that are, in fact, having to see the demand dry up is also going to permeate. So it's looking at everybody's business, not just the ones that we can see are directly being impacted.
Excellent point. Catherine, final to you.
Building on that, of course, to your point, Dawn, this will impact, let's be real, this will impact everybody. This is huge. And so we all need to be be informed about what's going on. It's changing, things are changing quickly. Make sure you get your information from reliable sources, such as OBOT, the Canadian Chamber, reliable news outlets. I mean, it sounds obvious to say, but there's a lot of misinformation out there, and we really need to guard against it. We're really proud of the trade tracker that we've put out, the Canadian Chamber. If you go on our website, you'll find it. What's really neat about it is that it goes beyond the macro numbers that everybody's talking about that kind of flies above your head. So we're talking about looking at the trade relationship and dependency at the subnational level. So how much does, Manitoba trade with Illinois? To that extent, what sectors are impacted? So for your business counterparts who are in the US, sharing that insight to them in terms of, well, this will impact you in Colorado, right? And we've seen when we go across the US, we are shocked how some very senior, sophisticated people are not aware of how much Canada plays a big part of their economy. I mean, the obvious border states, you can guess, right? Like Michigan, I think it's 14% of their economy that is linked to trade with Canada. But even like Texas, I think it's like 4%. So to some degree, all of the states are going to be impacted, and we need to be sharing that story. So, and I would say, also just as a last point, at the Canadian Chamber, as we talk to our US counterparts, as we talk to the media, as we talk to elected officials, We need your stories. We get asked about them. You are best placed to know how this will impact you on the granular level. If we're equipped with those stories and those examples, it really helps us. So please do work with your associations, with the Ottawa Board of Trade, with the Chamber, and share that input. Share also that input with your elected officials at all levels. There's an Ontario election coming. There's a federal election coming. The best time to talk to candidates and elected officials is when there's about to be an election. They'll be extra attentive. So please share how this will impact you and also what you need from them, because that will be the next discussion, is what can the government do? Are there subsidies? Are there programs? Are there, red tape cutting of certain things? Don't let them guess. Tell them what you need.
Very good, thank you. I think we have time for maybe one or two questions, if we have any questions for our panel from the audience. If you can introduce yourself and stand up, that'd be great.
Hi, Patrick Brown from Hydro Ottawa. If you'll permit, I'll try to sneak in two questions. Not to diminish the impacts that the tariffs are going to have, but is it a fair question to ask if there could have been a scenario where Canada would have been better positioned to absorb an impact like this? Don, I think of your presentation, the slide with a downward trend in investment. There's a school of thought that would say that was a crisis of our own making. So I'm wondering, what are some lessons learned from a risk management perspective in the current context? And then, if you will, the second question, there's been an interesting development with a lot of banks withdrawing from the global net zero banking alliance, and what's that indicative of? Are we now in a cycle where net zero, sustainability, maybe that's taking a backseat to more fundamental economic pressures and imperatives? I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that as well.
Well, I guess on the first one, I mean, as I said, we've been watching the deterioration in Canadian productivity for years, and there have been, consistent calls for getting rid of interprovincial trade barriers, reducing regulation that's burdensome. We look at, there's this one survey, I think the World Bank puts it together, as looking at time it takes to get a building permit, and like Canada looks terrible. And you're kind of like, seriously? Like, how can that be? But it is all of these, it's kind of like self-inflicted wounds that if we could just tackle the internal problems. The other thing is our tax system. Now, these are all not easy, but nonetheless, we know they're necessary if we're going to kick it up in terms of keeping our own house in order. And then when these big external shocks happen, I think we're just on a more firm footing. But none of it's easy, and it does take a great amount of political will to undertake such pretty big endeavors.
Do you want to?
Yeah, just on, of course, if we had diversified our trading partners a bit more, if, look back 10, 20 years, if we, had invested a bit more in that, obviously we'd be in a better position. Like, we don't have much leverage because of how reliant we are, but like, we know how that works with trading relationship. It's size and proximity. It's really hard to replicate that. Having said that, perhaps this is the time, better now than never, to be looking at the trade agreements we already have. We have, I think, 17, if I'm not mistaken, around the world. There's a lot of, strong, like-minded partners that are maybe low-hanging fruit, like Germany, for instance. And our partners in the Indo-Pacific as well. So, I mean, I know it's hard for smaller organizations to pivot there, but there are some programs actually that are encouraging that. EDC is spending a lot of time and money in encouraging businesses to think of other markets. So that's never a bad idea, but to answer your question, yes, if we had done that, we'd be in a better position now.
Yeah, we already needed to get our house in order, and I think a lot of the Americans were telling us that for several years. Internal trade is a huge one, and I remember Doug Ford saying yesterday that he would ban all U.S. wines from liquor stores, and I was thinking, okay, there's some good VQA, like Sandbanks, but there's some white wine that tastes like cheese too. And I would love to just be able to buy BC wine at least if I can't have American wine, but I can't. Mm-hmm. We can't have it. So that's cuckoo. And then, another thing, you hear our politicians saying, our leverage is going to be our critical minerals. Who knows how long they take to get out of the ground here? like 15 years. So again, the Americans are like, huh, I would have bought your critical minerals if you could get them out of the ground, but you can't, and you're not producing semiconductors here, so okay. So it's not that scary, right? Like, we had to get our house in order, to Don's point. On the second question about sustainability, that's a really interesting question, because I do have some sustainability industry clients. I think it's going to look different. The way I explain it right now and the way I think about it is there's sort of three financing pillars for sustainability industries, and one is government, one is philanthropy, and one is the private sector. I think in the US, and depending on how the next election goes in Canada, you may want to just scratch that government strategy for a while and not think about subsidies as much as you think about tax code. The other piece is philanthropy is, it only goes so high, especially in Canada. So I think business will still be there. I think the private sector will still be there. I do not think the IRA is going to be scrapped. I think it'll just be renamed the Trump Infrastructure Fund, because it is profitable on the US side. And remember, California can finance its own energy transition no matter what. So there's still going to be industry. But what I do think now about sustainability is that there were a lot of companies investing because it was the right thing to do. I don't think that's the case anymore. I think that the financial demonstration, over a certain amount of years, even 40 years if you're dealing with assets, it has to be there now. And I think that is core to survival.
Great, thank you. That was an excellent two-part question, and I'm really sorry, but we are at time. But what I can say is that we will continue to have these conversations for our business community with these experts. So can we give them a round of applause and appreciation? And Michael, shall I turn it over to you to wrap us up?
Thank you again, Su Ling. Also to Catherine, Don, and Allison, great job. A lot of takeaways there, too. I'd like to share your story, obviously being a journalist. Share your story with your industry association of boards of trade. Make sure they know what's happening in your sector for governments potentially to help out in various ways as we're in this difficult phase. As we wrap up, I just want to thank our event sponsors again, Hard Rock Hotel and Casino, one of the big parts of our story here in Ottawa, in addition to the local economy opening this spring. Mann Lawyers, thank you, gentlemen and ladies. The City of Ottawa, Algonquin College, Oakwood, Rogers Centre, Casino Lac Leamy, Event Design. A quick note on OBJ this year. I think part of this year, given the challenges, and it was set up here, make sure you got reliable news source. So hopefully we qualify in there, I think.
Definitely.
We do have a new program for subscribers. It's called OBJ Insider. Now 1,000 people strong in Ottawa. You can access exclusive news on a daily basis, something called the OBJ Data Center, which is 57 different ranked industry lists of Ottawa businesses, including executives, their clients, their specialty areas, also some print publications mailed to you. So check that out on screen. I think we've got a bit of a QR code there as well. The winter issue of OBJ is now on the streets. We asked, appropriately enough, the New Year's resolutions from a tech CEO, executive director of a BIA, real estate exec, head of Ottawa Tourism. So check that out. And finally, our book of lists will debut in February, February 19th at the Canadian War Museum. On behalf of the Board of Trade, His Worship Mayor Mark Sutcliffe, the Ottawa Business Journal, thank you for coming out. I think in these challenging times, it's ever important for Team Ottawa to come together face-to-face, make new relationships, rekindle ones, and talk about these issues and ensure that we've got a common narrative for the company, city, and make sure that we understand what's happening, what actions that we personally need to take. Thank you very much for joining us here today. Bonjour.